There's a specific version of the doubt that only comes at night. Not the regular kind, not the "I made a bad call today" kind, or the "this quarter is harder than expected" kind. The deeper one. The one that asks whether the whole thing was a mistake, whether you misread yourself when you started, whether you were wrong about what you were capable of. Most solopreneurs who've been on this path for more than a year know exactly what that question feels like. They just don't say it out loud, because saying it out loud feels like it might make it real. Here's what this video is going to do. It's going to name the question precisely, the actual words underneath the feeling. It's going to explain why it always arrives at night, specifically, and not at noon. And it's going to show you something about that question that changes what it means, not by dismissing it, but by understanding it. By the end of this, the question won't have disappeared, but it will carry less weight. And that specific distinction, weight reduced, not question erased, is the only honest version of what actually helps. The question has a few different surface forms. Sometimes it sounds like, am I actually building something real? Or am I just busy? Sometimes it sounds like, if I were really capable of this, wouldn't it feel different by now? Sometimes it's more direct. Did I make a catastrophic mistake, leaving behind the structure I had? And sometimes it's the quietest version, the one that doesn't use words at all, just a feeling of looking at everything you've built and not being able to confirm whether it's enough. But underneath all of those surface forms, the question is usually the same one. It's, was I wrong about myself when I started this? That's the one. That's the version that arrives at 2 a.m. when the defenses are down and the day's momentum has run out and there's no one to call. Here's what's important to name before anything else. Almost no one talks about this question. Not publicly, and often not privately either. Not in the podcasts about solopreneur success. Not in the communities where people post their revenue milestones. Not in the conversations you have with people who knew you before you started. And the silence around it does something specific. It makes the question feel singular, like you're the only one asking it. Like the people who are really built for this path don't have this particular conversation with themselves at 2 a.m. And the fact that you do is itself the answer. That's not a small thing, because a question you're asking alone, in the dark with no external reference point, is a question that only ever gets answered by your most exhausted, most isolated interpretation of yourself. And that interpretation is not accurate. But at 2 a.m., with no one to say otherwise, it feels like the most honest thing you've ever admitted. That's the specific texture of it. That's the question this video is about. And the first thing to understand is that you are not the only one asking it, not by a significant distance. And once you see that, the next question worth asking is, why does it always come at night? There's a reason the question arrives at 2 a.m. and not at 2 p.m. It isn't random. It isn't poetic. It's structural, and understanding the structure is the first thing that changes its weight. Here's what happens during the day when you're operating as a solo business. You're in motion. You're responding to things, making decisions, producing output, solving the next problem, and that motion does something specific to the doubt. It suppresses it, not because the doubt is gone, but because forward movement creates a kind of answer by default. You're still going, therefore presumably you're still capable of going. But the suppression has a cost. Every decision you make alone, every uncertainty you absorb without anyone to share the weight, every win that arrives into silence, all of it accumulates, not visibly, not in a way you can point to during the day, but it accumulates. Research on cognitive load and decision fatigue is consistent on this point. The executive function that handles emotional regulation, the part of your brain that usually talks the doubt back down, degrades significantly as the day goes on. By 2 a.m., after a full day of solo operation, that function is running on close to nothing. And here's the specific consequence for solo operators. In a team environment, the exhausted version of you still has external voices around it. Colleagues, a manager, a partner, someone whose presence interrupts the internal spiral before it completes. Not because they say the right thing, just because another person is there. But you're operating alone, which means that when the daytime defenses run out, when the momentum stops and the silence arrives, the only voice left is the one that's been carrying the accumulated weight of every unconfirmed decision, every uncelebrated win, every question you've been waiting for someone to answer. That's why 2 a.m. Not because the doubt is more true at night, because the structure of solo operation removes, systematically, everything that would otherwise interrupt it. The question doesn't arrive at 2 a.m. because the answer is yes. It arrives because you've been waiting, alone, in the silence long enough for your most exhausted self to start filling it in. Which brings us to the thing that actually changes when you understand the mechanism. Here's the thing that changes when you understand the mechanism. The 2 a.m. question feels like a verdict. It feels like your deepest self, stripped of performance and pretense, finally telling you the truth. It feels like clarity, the uncomfortable kind, the kind you've been avoiding during the day by staying busy and moving forward. And that feeling is so convincing, because it arrives in a register that mimics honesty. It sounds like, now that you're not performing, now that nobody's watching, now that the day is over, here's what's actually true. But here's the specific thing that happens when judgment runs in isolation long enough. And this is the part that matters. Your internal narrator loses its calibration. In a team environment, the story you tell about yourself gets tested constantly. Someone pushes back on an idea. Someone confirms that a decision was right. Someone witnesses a win and registers what it cost. That friction, even when it's uncomfortable, keeps the internal narrator anchored to something external. It stays calibrated. When you operate alone for long enough, that external calibration disappears. And what fills the gap is not clarity. It's a narrative built entirely from the inside, which means it reflects your fears as much as your reality, your exhaustion as much as your capability, the accumulated weight of unwitnessed effort as much as the actual quality of what you've built. That's not a personal observation, that's structural. The 2 a.m. question, was I wrong about myself when I started this, is not your deepest self telling you the truth. It's your most exhausted self, running without calibration, in conditions that were never designed for one nervous system to carry alone, asking the question that the silence made room for. Here's the honest version of what that means. The question is real. The pain underneath it is real. The weight of it at 2 a.m. is real. But the question is not a verdict. It's a signal, a specific, structural signal that you have been carrying this alone for long enough that the silence has started talking. And the difference between those two readings, verdict versus signal, is not a small distinction. It's the one that determines whether the question has any useful information in it. Because if it's a verdict, you have to answer it. You have to decide at 2 a.m. whether you were right to start. And nothing good has ever come from that decision made at that hour, alone. But if it's a signal, if it's telling you something about your operating conditions rather than something about your capability, then it becomes a different kind of question. Not, was I wrong? But what does this need? That's a question you can actually answer. Not at 2 a.m., but eventually. If the mechanism this video named landed for you, if you recognize not just the question, but the deeper pattern underneath it, there's a resource in the description built specifically for what comes next. It's a 7-day guided process for separating what you've built from who you are, and rebuilding the internal confidence that doesn't depend on external validation to hold. The video gave you the language. The link in the description is for the work. So what do you actually do with this? Not at 2 a.m. There's almost nothing useful to do at 2 a.m. except stop trying to answer the question. But in the day that follows, in the accumulated pattern of how this path is lived, the first thing is the simplest, and also the one that tends to resist being simple. When the 2 a.m. question arrives, don't answer it. Not because the question is wrong, because answering a calibration question without a calibrated narrator is the same as measuring distance with a ruler that's been left in the heat. The tool isn't wrong. The conditions are. The second thing is a distinction worth carrying. There are two kinds of doubt that can surface on the solo path. One is structural, generated by isolation, fatigue, the absence of external calibration. It arrives when the defenses are down. It feels universal and final. It says the whole thing was a mistake. The other is signal, generated by genuine misalignment, something specific that isn't working, a direction that deserves reconsideration. It arrives during the day. It points at something particular. It says this specific thing needs to change. Most solopreneurs who've been on this path for more than 2 years have felt both. They are not the same experience, even though they can feel similar at 2 a.m. when everything collapses into the same register. The structural doubt is not telling you to quit. It's telling you something about your operating conditions. The signal doubt is worth examining carefully, during the day, with whatever calibration you can access. Knowing which one is speaking is the most important diagnostic skill you can develop on the solo path. And here's the honest truth about developing it. It's almost impossible to develop it alone, not because you're not capable of the discernment, but because the discernment itself requires an external reference point. Someone who understands the stakes, someone who can tell the difference from the outside between This person is in structural doubt, and this person has identified something real. That's not weakness. What high-functioning solo operators actually do, the ones who stay on this path for a decade and build something real, is eventually create the conditions for that calibration, not by hiring a team, not by compromising the independence that made them start, but by finding one or two people who understand the path well enough to be a reference point when the internal narrator goes unchecked. That's the work, not the 2 a.m. work. There is no useful 2 a.m. work, the daylight work. The deliberate structural work of building the calibration, the path, doesn't provide automatically. If the question this video named is one you've been carrying, the link in the description is for what comes after naming it. It's already there when you're ready. What does your 2 a.m. question actually sound like? Not the general shape of it, but the specific words. Leave it in the comments. Going solo wasn't a mistake. The difficulty isn't evidence against the choice. It's evidence of what the choice actually asks. The solopreneur who asks the 2 a.m. question is not someone who misread themselves when they started. They're someone who has been carrying the full weight of this path without the structural support that weight was always going to require. And those are not the same thing, even though at 2 a.m. they feel identical. Here's the specific thing worth carrying out of this video. The question doesn't come because the answer is yes. It comes because you've been in the silence long enough for your most exhausted self to start filling it in. And the most exhausted version of you is not the most accurate version. It's just the version that's left when everything else runs out. The 2 a.m. question is not a verdict. It's a structural artifact, a predictable consequence of operating alone, without calibration, without witnesses, without anyone to interrupt the spiral before it completes. And once you know that, once you can name the mechanism rather than just feel the weight of the question, something shifts, not dramatically, not in a way you'll write down or celebrate, but quietly, functionally. The question carries less authority. It becomes information about your operating conditions, rather than information about your capability. And that specific shift, from verdict to signal, from personal failing to structural consequence, is the beginning of knowing what to actually do about it. The path wasn't wrong, the question was always going to come. And now you know what it is. One move at a time,